For tonight's webinar, we're going to talk about Debar Pond Lodge. And to orient everyone, and if you were all in the audience and I could see you, I'd ask you to raise your hands to find out how many of you have been to Debar Pond Lodge, how many know where it is. But here's like, oh, you can raise your hands that way. Excellent. So thank you to those who've just raised their hands. To orient you a little bit, here is a map. There's the blue line, and Debar Mountain Wild Forest is here, and then you see Debar Pond Lodge is right here. So it's at the edge of Debar Mountain Wild Forest, and I don't know if you can all see my cursor, but it's right here at this little kind of point of Debar Pond. So I'm going to talk a little bit about why we've been so engaged in efforts to preserve it over the years, and a little bit more about what it is. If you haven't been there, when you arrive at the clearing for the Debar Pond Lodge complex, you're initially greeted by a series of outbuildings, and you're heading down a slope towards the pond, and that path leads to the main lodge. Debar Pond itself was named after a Canadian hunter and trapper whose family were well-known Franklin County guides. And in the late 19th century, Robert Schroeder, the son of a German brewer, was a big hop grower and planted 300 acres of hops at Debar Pond, making it one of the largest hop farms in the world at the time. So it has this very interesting history. Mr. Schroeder built a 60-room mansion on the site. So the current Debar Pond Lodge is 17 rooms. So you could imagine a 60-room mansion on the site. And unfortunately, he did not retain his fortune and had a tragic passing in the early 20th century. Upon that passing in 1910, this mansion sat vacant until 1939. And that's when Arthur Wheeler, the president of the American Can Company, purchased the site. The Wheelers, Mr. and Mrs. Wheeler and their 3 children, demolished the pre-existing house and hired Saranac Lake architect William Distin to design a new and fashionable grape camp for their family of 5. The Wheelers' new camp, they called Redgate Farm, overlooked Debar Pond, pictured here from the front of the lodge. And you get a sense of just how picturesque this site is. Architect William Distin, who's shown here with the Hochschilds, nothing to do with Debar Pond, the Hochschilds of Blue Mountain Lake, also clients of his. William Distin had originally worked under William Coulter, a prolific designer of rustic camps, sanatorium buildings, churches, and many other buildings throughout the Adirondacks. Distin worked in Coulter's firm as a draftsperson, attending Columbia University's architecture school after Coulter passed in 1907, and then returned to work in the successor firm, which became known as Westhoff and Distin. In addition to Debar Pond Lodge, Distin designed dozens of buildings throughout the Adirondacks, including the Adirondack Community Church in Lake Placid, the 1932 Olympic Ice Arena, Eagle Nest and Minnow Brook on Blue Mountain Lake, and many others. Debar Pond Lodge itself, shown here, this is the front of Debar Pond Lodge overlooking the Debar Pond. So that picture in the previous slide would have been taken from about right in front here where my cursor is. And here's the back of the building, which you see upon approach, back/front, depending on how you want to orient it. And you can see Debar Pond in the distance here. So this building marks at this transitional period. Well, it continued the tradition of using local rustic materials and siding that took full advantage of the camp's natural surroundings. It also moved into a more 20th century interpretation of the traditional camp design. And this is something I think is very cool about this building. So instead of using whole logs, it used half spruce logs as really a siding for the building, and new materials such as metal windows you see here in this photograph. In addition, the multi-level living spaces and combination of all the quarters, you have the family quarters, the guest quarters, the service spaces, social and domestic. The kitchen is in the same space as the entertaining great room, all under one roof. which is a deviation from many of the typical late 19th and early 20th century Adirondack great camps. And I think this multi-level design, when you're inside, it really feels like more like a kind of early mid 20th century building. In 1979, New York State purchased a 1,200-acre estate, which included all of the 1940 buildings that Distin designed for Mr. Wheeler. It included Debar Pond and surrounding land. As a condition of the sale, the state allowed use of the lodge via lease to a private family for 25 years. In 2004, that lease expired and the entire property became part of the Adirondack Forest Preserve under the management and control of the Department of Environmental Conservation. So 1979 and 2004 were both pivotal years in the history and future of what led to where we are now with Debar Pond Lodge. Throughout this time, AARCH has advocated for the maintenance and restoration of Debar Pond Lodge, sponsoring tours of the site, research, and the ultimate National Register nomination. It was listed on the National Register of Historic Places in 2014. Following DEC's proposal in 2020 to demolish the lodge, AARCH worked with preservation partners, including the Preservation League of New York State, the newly formed Debar Pond Institute, and community members to advocate for the site's preservation. A site visit in 2022 shows that the interior and the exterior remain in remarkably good condition despite 19 years of vacancy, with wood paneling, architectural detailing, fixtures, windows all intact. There has been also, you see from the outside, the boarded up windows signify that it's vacant, but they also protect the interior from break-ins or damage to the historic metal windows, which are also all intact. In addition, the DEC has done some light repair work, patching some parts of the roof where water has infiltrated. So it has not sat untouched in recent years, and that has helped prevent water infiltration on the interior. So in so many instances, when people tend to come together to save a building that's threatened with demolition, when a building owner says they're going to tear down a beloved building and the outcry is that they not do that, the common response is, well, then why don't you figure out what to do with it? You can take ownership. You can figure out a new use. Well, in this instance, we've done exactly that. And by we, I say actually, Kirschenbaum, who's one of our panelists here today, has taken leadership on that effort. And it's a rare situation where you have all of that coming together through dedicated preservation advocates, through community support, and through fundraising efforts to arrive at that solution. And with that, I'm going to introduce Howie Kirschenbaum to pick up the conversation and talk a little bit more about what I mean when I say we have a solution. And I'll give a little intro to Howie. Howie Kirschenbaum was the founder and the first president of Adirondack Architectural Heritage. In his long career in Adirondack preservation, he has been instrumental in preserving some of the region's most important architectural treasures, including Great Camp Sagamore, Camp Buncas, Camp Santanoni, White Pine Camp, and others. And for the last several years, he's worked very hard in collaboration with us in the Preservation League of New York State, but really leading the effort to preserve the endangered Debar Pond Lodge, which is the subject of this webinar. Dave Gibson, who's the managing partner of the nonprofit advocate Adirondack Wild, is in the audience there, but has had some challenges joining as a panelist. So we'll hope that we can have Dave join us, and I will start off by asking Howie to talk a little bit about Debar Pond Institute, who I've mentioned a couple of times now, and if you could share, why was it founded, what is its mission, and a little bit about your efforts on that behalf.
Okay, thanks, Erin. So I'm going to, I guess, respond to Erin's first question of how I got involved and how we got involved by backing up a little bit. For 15 or 20 years, Steve Engelhardt, the former executive director of AARCH, and I had been working, been concerned about Debar Pond Lodge. Wonderful building with such potential to have people enjoy it and learn about the history of the Adirondacks and Adirondack architecture and enjoy the Adirondacks through using this wonderful building. So AARCH had been trying to find solutions for it and worked on and off and had conversations on and off, would lead a couple of tours, would be in meetings with other groups to try to find solutions, but didn't seem to be working out. And we were all rather surprised back in, I guess, 2021, was it, when the state announced that it had decided that there were no viable solutions for Debar Pond Lodge and they wanted to tear it down, wanted to remove it. As most of you probably know, the reason for that is in the Adirondacks, in which state forest preserve lands are required to be forever wild. The tradition has been, and the practice has been, when the state acquires buildings on land for the forest preserve, they remove those buildings. Sometimes there are other uses the building can be put to, but that's with very narrow room to accomplish that. The state concluded that there was no viable solution in this case, and therefore the buildings would have to be removed. So that's when AARCH and I got involved in trying to find a solution for it. We had been considering the solutions for some time, so we weren't caught exactly cold, and we were ready to spring into action very quickly. And in my experience, in quite a few decades of working on historic preservation in the Adirondacks, to try to save a building in the forest preserve, or more broadly, to come up with a solution for a building or a building complex, a historic site that's endangered, the best way to succeed is when an organization comes in and says, we have a plan, we have a vision, and we're willing to take responsibility to make it happen. Otherwise, it goes back and forth in discussions of what's feasible, what's not feasible. Well, that's not going to work. But when a specific proposal is made, it has at least a chance then of being seriously considered. So we quickly went into gear and put together two things. First was a coalition of organizations who said, no, Debar Pond Lodge is too important, too valuable, has too great a potential to simply remove it, that there are solutions here. And we proposed that solution, and I'll talk about that solution in a minute, but it was the fact that we made a proposal, a realistic proposal, that enabled a great coalition of organizations, including local government, the town of Duane, Franklin County Board of Legislators, the Adirondack Association of Towns and Villages, the Adirondack Park Local Government Review Board. In other words, all the relevant agencies of local and regional government supported the preservation of Debar Pond Lodge. Historic preservation organizations naturally supported saving Debar, including Adirondack Architectural Heritage, Historic Saranac Lake, Preservation League of New York State. We were very pleased that two of the leading environmental organizations for the Adirondacks, in fact, just as I was saying that, I saw Dave Gibson's name come up on the banner up ahead here, so I hope it means he's getting ready to be able to be involved. That both the Adirondack Council and the Adirondack Wild Friend of the Forest Preserve, two very respected environmental Adirondack organizations, supported the preservation of Debar. The economic development groups like the Adirondack North Country Association, Adirondack Diversity Initiative, the Malone Chamber of Commerce, and local state legislators immediately wanted to work and be part of the solution, come up with a solution for saving Debar. So we got a coalition of organizations that really was very broad-based, that to support the Debar's preservation. And the second part of being able to turn the corner here, of being able to come up with a potential solution, was having an organization that would be willing to take responsibility. And so I invited some leading preservationists around the Adirondacks to join me in forming a new nonprofit organization, Debar Pond Institute, who said, we will take responsibility for the fundraising involved. And we indeed got some significant financial commitments that would enable us to buy land to trade to the state of New York in return for Debar Pond Lodge. And this was the proposal that we made, that proposing an amendment to the state constitution. The proposal was a land exchange amendment to the state constitution, in which Debar Pond Lodge would receive from the state 6 acres and the building complex at Debar, the National Historic Site. And in return, Debar Pond Lodge would donate or trade at least 400 acres of wild forest land to the state of New York to become part of the State Forest Preserve. Thus, at no cost to the state, the lodge would be saved. The public, as part of our proposal, the public still have excellent access to Debar Pond and its recreational facilities, and the State Forest Preserve would be enhanced by at least 400 acres. So with that solution, we were able to put together this coalition, and that was about 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago now. And a lot has happened in those 2.5 years, but that is, in short, we'll go into more details about it, how it would work, and what would we do with the lodge if it were to be preserved. So there's a lot of questions we'll address, but I think maybe this is a good point for me to stop and turn it back to you, Erin, for your next question.
Thank you, Howie. And Dave, I want to just pause and take a moment here to introduce you and share a little bit about your background. Dave Gibson is a managing partner of the nonprofit advocate Adirondack Wild, Friends of the Forest Preserve, and has worked with Adirondack Wild since 2010. Before that, Dave was executive director of the Association for the Protection of the Adirondacks from 1987 until 2010. He helped develop and open an Adirondack Learning Center and Research Library, the Center for the Forest Preserve, and has worked for the New York State Office of Parks and other organizations. Dave is a regular contributor to Adirondack and the Adirondack Mountain Club publication and New York Almanac. He lives with his family in Ballston Lake and maintains an Adirondack cabin built by Friends of the Forest Preserve founder, Paul Schaefer. With that, I will go into my next question. My first question was for Howie, so that worked out perfectly. So now, Dave, in 2020, you wrote in the Adirondack Explorer, where you are a frequent contributor, that Debar Pond Lodge should not stay. And this was at the very beginning when DEC had proposed demolition and a more intensive use for the site. So could you share a little bit about that analysis and what has changed so that your organization, Adirondack Wild, now supports preservation of the site and the constitutional amendment?
Sure. Thanks, Erin. Thanks, Howie. I got involved in this back in 2004. When it became apparent that the Department of Environmental Conservation had become the fee owner of the entire Debar parcel, including the lodge. and that there was no reserved rights anymore, as Howie described earlier. Those had expired. And so I remember writing to DEC and Raybrook saying, "You've got a constitutional problem." And I described it. It's Howie's already going into this in detail, and the buildings can't stay, and yet and yet they punted that ball down the field for a long time, many years later. And lo and behold, in 2020, Aaron, we all got this notice from the department that they wanted to tear down Debar Lodge and create an intensive use area on 42 acres on the parcel adjoining Debar Pond. And we were just astounded that they would not consider other alternatives. That was their preferred alternative, and it was going before the Adirondack Park Agency. So we wrote a detailed letter about why they had failed to consider alternatives as SEQA requires. They had failed to consider the state land master plan and what it says about intensive use areas. And they had failed to discuss what other options might exist, including the historic classification within the state land master plan to preserve the lodge. And we said, so we said, you have all these other possibilities, you have not examined them, and therefore you're acting illegally. And so thanks to not our letter, but all these letters, including letters from Howie and others, I'm sure, and the department pulled back. The Commissioner Basil Sagos pulled back, and also made us aware that there was a potential for an Article 14 land exchange. And so the more we examine that, Aaron, and visiting Debar Pond, the more we realize that the lodge could be preserved in this manner on just a few acres, and public access and protection of Debar Pond could continue. And there'd be no, those two goals could be pursued simultaneously. In addition, that there was these 200 to 400 acres down near Meacham Lake that could be added to the forest preserve in exchange for just a few acres on the Debar parcel. And that the public, again, would have this guaranteed access to the pond, but also that the pond would be protected. And we felt all along since 2020 that this gem of a lake, and with high water quality and magnificent scenery, needed to be the high priority. And we were delighted when Howie and the Debar Pond Institute, the Debar Lodge Institute, felt similarly that the pond needed to be protected. There needed to be public access, controlled public access to it. And the lodge could be preserved for cultural programs that, frankly, in the northern Adirondacks are few and far between. Whether it's Saranac Lake or Malone, a future Debar Pond Lodge could provide some wonderful cultural programming that is not now available. I mean, Sagamore is a great example of what can happen in the central Adirondacks for the last 30 years. And my mentor, Paul Schaefer, said there's no inconsistency between preserving this wonderful heritage, cultural heritage, and there's so few left, and preserving wilderness. These things are compatible because the former fits into the landscape. It was designed that way by the owners. And so there's a compatibility within the Adirondack landscape. And it can be done by Article 14 by a fair land exchange. And Paul Schaefer, our founder, got behind Sagamore land exchange very strongly. And so he taught me for 10 years about, he was a builder, but he's also one of the great wilderness protectors of the 20th century. And so it seemed that as long as there was an easement that put some guarantees down for the public, that the lodge would be preserved in the following manner prescribed, and that the public would have access to the pond and also ensure its continued protection within the forest preserve. And get a land exchange in addition, new forest preserve added just down the road near Meacham Lake. All those things added up to us as a very good proposal.
Thank you. Thank you, David. Howie, could you maybe talk a little bit about the amendment land exchange legislation a little bit more in terms of, its benefits, a bit more of the specifics of it, and perhaps who supports this legislation and status? There's often a lot of questions about that, the land that the state will gain and the public benefit.
Sure. So the land exchange amendment, which is actually a piece of legislation that is currently being considered and moving through the New York State Legislature, has several key components in it. One of the components is the more information about the land that the state will receive from Debar Pond Institute. And we were very fortunate that one of the board members of Adirondack Architecture of Debar Pond Institute actually their family owns a parcel of land adjoining right next to the Meacham Lake State Campground, consisting of 406 acres, including a nice hill with a view toward the mountains, and 2 miles of road frontage along scenic Route 30, which is a designated state scenic highway route. So he has made available this 406 acre parcel. Debar Pond Institute has a legally binding agreement that we can acquire this 406 acre parcel of land for $10 if the amendment passes the legislature and the voters of New York State. And so that's one piece of the specifics of the amendment, that there is designated a valuable parcel of land that the Department of Environmental Conservation has agreed would be a very desirable acquisition for the forest preserve. And in return for that 406 acre parcel, as I mentioned before, the state would trade to Debar Pond Institute 6 acres and the buildings at the historic site. But the buildings and land, that 6 acres, will come with an enormous set of conditions and restrictions to ensure, in the language of the amendment, that the natural and historic character of the parcel is maintained. And so Debar Pond Institute and Adirondack Architectural Heritage has been working very closely with the Department of Environmental Conservation for the last 2 years to hammer out a conservation easement that would go with the land, that would run with the deed to Debar Pond Lodge, and the 6 acres that would ensure the natural and historic character of the property. For example, I'll give a few examples. It's a 35-page document currently, so I can't go into all the details, but just to give a highlight, some of the highlights of it. On the preservation side, the property would have to be treated consistently with the Secretary of Interior standards for the preservation, the rehabilitation of historic buildings. There'll be no motorboats on the lake. It's not even going to be a dock on the lake shore. Of course, things like mining and gravel extraction and so on are disallowed. The property, so the natural character of the lake and the surrounding mountains will be preserved. The buildings will be preserved, and in addition, there'll be various public uses of Debar. For one thing, the lines of the property are drawn in such a way that the public will still have the convenient access by trail to Debar Pond from the public parking area, so that in fact, the public can get to a place still on state land. I think it's the best site on Debar Pond for swimming, putting boats in, picnicking. That will still be adjoining the private parcel, but on state land and available conveniently to the public. In addition, Debar Pond Institute would give the public a right-of-way on the other side, the western portion of the Debar parcel, to gain access to the Debar Pond, Debar Mountain, and the trail around the pond. So there'll be two access trails, one on state land adjoining the private parcel, the other within the private parcel at the edge of it, that enable the public to get to and around the lake. In addition, the public will be allowed 1 day a week. The Debar Pond Institute will have to open up the property to the public, including the interior of the lodge, for public tours. That's 1 day a week for the main season, for about 4 months of the year in June, July, August, September, and even so even a little longer than that. So about 4.5 months, the property will be regularly available to the public. Now, the Debar Pond Institute, I can talk about this a little bit later, what our plans for it, but we'll have plenty of public uses throughout the year, but those are absolutely guaranteed by the conservation easement. And we'll also be granting a right-of-way to the state to allow for special handicap use that will enable cars and vehicles with the proper permit to drive a bit closer to the lake, not too close to the lake, because that would defeat the purpose of keeping the area natural, but providing some parking areas and access to the lake, and then a hardened path for wheelchairs that will go right through the private Debar Pond parcel. So those are just a few of the many requirements that we've worked out with the state. I'd say my estimate is we're 90% through the work on that document. There's still some questions remaining that still to be worked out, but I think it's been a very cooperative relationship. The department's pretty busy with lots of projects managing the forest preserve, so sometimes it might take several months before we can move to the next stage of the planning process. But we believe that all sides have worked in good faith to come up with a solution that meets the needs of the public and the forest preserve, and provides a viable way for a private or nonprofit organization to succeed operating this historic site in the public interest.
So Dave, could you tell us a little bit, because Adirondack Wild, so Howie has described the amendment as it pertains to Debar Pond, to the lodge and to access. Can you tell us a little bit about how this amendment, from your perspective, fits into the history of other constitutional amendments within the Forest Preserve? And one of those was Great Camp Sagamore, which Howie was very instrumental in, and I'm sure can talk more to, but you have a bit of an overview perspective on this as your organization is engaged with really all of the amendments as it pertains to the Forest Preserve. Could you share a little bit about that and how the Debar Amendment fits in?
Sure. There's Aaron, there's a long history of land exchanges within the Adirondack Forest Preserve and the Catskill Forest Preserve, and going back to many, many decades. So paper companies have taken advantage of them to consolidate their ownerships. Back in the day when there were paper companies still working in the park, to consolidate their private ownerships for forestry and to consolidate the Forest Preserve, where there was once a checkerboard, now there's distinct parcels and boundaries. So that's one solution that the land exchange system was meant to come up with. And then, of course, historic preservation came up, really in 1978. I mean, that was even before the Great Camp book, Harvey Kaiser's book, came out in the early 80s. In 1978, there was a big conference on cultural heritage in the wilds. And 1978, I think Paul Malo and Paul Schaefer, and Paul Malo being the great architect at Syracuse University, and Paul Schaefer being the great wilderness preservationist, were co-hosts of this conference. And that led to the Sagamore Amendment in Racket Lake. and as a viable, way to consolidate Sagamore's historic buildings in one parcel, and then add to the forest preserve at the perimeter, in that which is now Blue Ridge Wilderness. So those are just two examples of many, about a dozen land exchanges, including landfills, small airports, airfields, like at Pasico. That was an exchange just to expand that airport at Pasico in Hamilton County. So there's a long heritage of doing this. What's critical, of course, is that there be a public benefit from our point of view, from Friends of the Forest Preserve, Adirondack Wild's point of view. It can't just benefit a private enterprise. There has to be an overall community and public benefit to get our endorsement. And the way we look at this, Debar Pond Lodge, is that there is one. There is to provide not just adding to the forest preserve as significantly as Howie described, and protecting Debar Pond to remain forever wild, but also to add this new opportunity for cultural performances, programming between Saranac Lake and Malone. I think that's very, very important for the park as a whole. And it's not going to duplicate what Sagamore does. No one can duplicate that unique institution at Racket Lake or at Santanoni. But it'll have its, if successful, this will have a unique relationship with the community. And I'm sure it will develop its own unique and successful programming that will benefit the Northern Adirondacks. So that's a public benefit all around.
And of course, as we're talking about issues with, heightened use in particular sections of the park and the forest preserve, bringing more attention to this section of the park and the Debar Mountain Wild Forest and the pond, I think will also could potentially help lessen some of those, capacity issues elsewhere. So Howie, could you, David mentioned the Sagamore Amendment, and that was one that you were greatly engaged on, if not the architect of. Could you talk a little bit about that, maybe in even more detail, how that came about and why that's a good model for saving this building?
Well, the Sagamore Amendment, it's interesting, that's 40 years ago. It's hard to believe, but it was 40 years ago when the voters approved the Sagamore Amendment to the state constitution. And it would probably be useful to remind people, because it's not obvious, of what you have to do to amend the Constitution in New York State. It's not just a matter of the legislature passing a law to say we changed the Constitution. The framers wanted to be sure that a document as important as a Constitution could not be changed simply with one political current 1 year or one new administration, but would really have to undergo enormous scrutiny. So the way to pass a constitutional amendment is first to have one session of the state legislature, both the Assembly and the Senate, vote by majority in each house to pass the legislation that authorizes the land exchange. And then every 2 years there's a new session of the state legislature. So after that session where it was passed by the legislature, when that year or two is up, then a newly elected legislature, because the legislature is reelected every 2 years, the next legislature after the election also must pass the same amendment again. So it has to pass the legislature twice, and then it goes before all the voters of New York State as a constitutional amendment on the ballot for the voters to decide. So in the case of Sagamore, we had that long process of passing 2 sessions of the state legislature. In both cases, the vote ultimately was almost unanimous. And then it went before the voters of New York State. The Preservation League of New York State was our partner at that time. This is before AARCH existed. And together we spearheaded a statewide campaign, literally all over New York State, to try to educate the voters on the merits of the land exchange. And we succeeded with 62% of the voters, about 1,550,000 voters, 62% of those voting voted in favor of the Sagamore Land Exchange Amendment, and thus it passed. And so we have our work cut out for us still. We're just, in a sense, we're at the beginning of that process. We 2 years ago, the bills were introduced in both houses of the legislature, but it was a little late in the season and didn't get very far. Last year, the bills were introduced, and the Debar Pond Land Exchange actually passed the Assembly by a unanimous vote. And but unfortunately, it didn't get to the final version of the bill, didn't get to the Senate in time to go through that process. We don't know if it would have passed or not, but it just, time ran out. And now we just had a new session of the legislature start. So we have to start all over again because the 2-year session just ended. So the fact that it passed the Assembly doesn't count for anything. So we're starting over again now, and it's starting to work its way through the houses. We just heard yesterday the Judiciary Committee in the state Senate passed the bill, the Debar bill, out, and it's going on to another committee now. And so we'll be working very hard in the next couple of months to try to achieve first passage of the legislation.
One of the questions in the audience is asking more specifically what the public will be able to do at Debar Pond. Can they fish, for example? There's swimming, fishing, kayaking, picnicking. I think that fishing question is one that I certainly wouldn't know the answer to, but perhaps one of you do.
I think it's never come up because you can fish just about most any place on the forest preserve where there's fish, and that people fish on Debar Pond now, and they will still fish on Debar Pond because the whole pond remains on the forest preserve, and there'll be good public access to the forest preserve. But that, I think the question is maybe bigger than just the fishing of like what's going to happen that both on the state forest preserve and the private Debar Pond parcel if the land exchange comes to pass. Again, the public will have access to all the things that Aaron just said: cross-country skiing, as well in the winter, ice fishing, and there is a trail from Debar Pond Lodge to Debar Mountain. It's about I think about a 3,400, 3,600 foot peak with great views, and a trail around the lake will be a great recreational activity for people either staying at the lodge or just coming for the day to use state land. The state of New York intends to move the current public parking area, which is now about a quarter of a mile, a little bit more back from the lake, about half the way closer to the lake. So maybe 800 feet, 700 feet back from the shoreline, a convenient access to the lake. And as far as Debar Pond Institute's plans for the lodge itself, we envision a varied program. We haven't spent most of our effort has gone into the effort to save the property from destruction, and it will certainly require probably some experimentation of what programs work most effectively at Debar, but we envision it to be quite a wide variety of programs. including conferences and meetings and workshops and training programs that have to do with the outdoors and or history or other public issues. So in that sense, somewhat like Sagamore Conference Center, Great Camp Sagamore, which has a full roster of programs, educational and recreational programs for the public. But we also see it somewhat like the Adirondack Lodge of the Adirondack Mountain Club, in the sense of accommodations, reasonably priced accommodations for the public recreationists, those who would love to come and spend some time and enjoy the outdoors around Debar, and enjoy the indoors at Debar, the beautiful buildings and setting. So it's both a combination of workshops and conferences, public lodging, and the public tours that will happen on a weekly basis in season. So that combination of programs will characterize the majority of use of the property. And we think it's realistic. I mean, there's been discussions of, well, there's only 12 bedrooms inside, or 10 or 12 bedrooms, depending how you count it, or whether you include the caretaker's building with 2 or 3 bedrooms. Is that going to be enough to make it economically? I've been involved in lodging operations at Sagamore, and I was the director of Sagamore, and privately at Camp Uncas, and at White Pine Camp, where we have a major accommodations open to the public, all historic sites that found this adaptive use that enabled them to be enjoyed by thousands of people. And I think it's realistic. And we have a board of directors of Debar Pond Institute that has a lot of experience with combining environmental projects and historic preservation projects and tourist and lodging projects, including Pat Benton, for example, who ran the historic Hedges historic site hotel on Blue Mountain Lake for 20 years. And the Mary Hoteling, who was head of historic Saranac Lake. Other board members are the chair and the originally Nikki Hilton Patterson, now Melanie Redding, the associate director of Adirondack Diversity Institute, who sees their mission is to have greater diversity represented in residents and tourists in the Adirondacks, and they see Debar Pond Lodge as an excellent place for some of the programs they're currently running at different sites around the Adirondacks. We have people who have been involved in Adirondack Architectural Heritage, former presidents, and we have Ned Lemieux, the manager, the supervisor of the town of Duane, recently deceased, sadly, is one of our founding board members, because the local people locally would like to give good use to Debar Pond Lodge as well. Jake Silverstein, the owner of Adirondack Life magazine, is on our board and gives us access to some publicity or get word out about Debar Pond to the public, and I could mention others, but we think we have a realistic plan for using Debar Pond Lodge in a variety of ways, virtually all of which are public uses, and which we think will make a viable operation.
There was a question, concern about the lodge looking forlorn, which it does, but kind of as I said in the presentation, I want to just let people know, while it is boarded up, that is to protect it, and that's actually a good thing, and a symbol of our partnership and working with DEC to protect the site. So having boards on the windows is actually a very good thing. It's good for the building so that people can break in and the windows remain intact. So it's actually in remarkably good shape. There's, you know, going through it, there's not water coming in. It's, you know, we're lucky for that. So it's in better shape than it looks, perhaps. And let's see, some other questions.
If I can just add to that. Yeah, it does look a little forlorn, as any building that's been abandoned for 15 years and boarded up will. But nothing, and this is tongue in cheek, nothing that $1 million won't solve. And that's, you know, that's a fairly realistic, maybe a little underestimate, but we feel we've raised and have guarantees, promises of enough money that we can exchange the land and refurbish the lodge. And you know, it needs a new roof. It'll probably need a whole new septic system. It'll probably need some asbestos removal. It'll need rehabilitation of the plumbing, no doubt, the heating system. It's totally empty of furnishings right now, so it'll need a whole new set of furnishings. And but we believe we have a realistic plan. We have, if not all, most of the funds will be ready to do the refurbish it. And ironically, we'll actually save the state several $100,000 by not having to tear down that building and restore the site. The first appearances are not to be trusted here. It's a solid building that should last for another 100 years.
I'm just going to mention, Aaron and Howie, that when the department proposed an intensive use recreational hub there by tearing down the lodge and creating picnic areas and grill areas and all sorts of intensive uses like campgrounds, you know, they use the phrase, we can protect it if we develop it. And that's always struck us as wrong, that people come to Debar Pond, and as you know, Howie, you said it, every day, and Aaron, they're coming to Debar Pond to enjoy the solitude and the beauty, the incredible fjord-like environment that the pond and the mountains flanking it on both sides sits within. They come for that environment, whether they're walking the dog or just standing in awe of that landscape, because the entire eye and mind and spirit are focused either on the lodge itself, which is right in your viewscape, or on the pond and the mountains, fjord-like environment beyond it. And all of that art, you know, the visitor's attention is so focused. And unlike some other great camps that I know, and I love Sagamore, but your eye isn't focused there as it is here at Debar Pond. And I think that's a great advantage.
And along those lines, we do have a question, and I thought this might be a good one for you, Dave, about, you know, how will, well, it's a two-part question, but one of it is concerning protection of the pond's wild characteristics. And the question phrases it, if the public has access to the pond, but we should clarify, they already have access, right? This is not new public access. This is existing public access.
Yes.
So,
yeah,
so maybe you can speak to that.
No, I think you're exactly right. And there hasn't been a lot of use. There's consistent use, but not overuse. And I think, you know, the way this proposal may work out is that the private and the public interests are served by protecting the pond. They're mutually served. And that the pond's environment, I think, is high on the minds of the private proponents of this exchange, as well as on groups like mine, Friends of the Forest Preserve, you know, what the state was proposing as an alternative was an intensive use area that would allow electric motors on Debar Pond and a lot of other intensive uses near the pond. And I think that really spelled a lot of opposition. And so I'm glad that was pulled back. And now we're considering this land exchange as a real alternative to preserving Debar Pond forever.
And there are a couple of questions about parking, and one I think is, you do have to, there will be some portaging for people with their kayak or canoe, which, is somewhat perhaps appropriate. And so along those veins, how close to the pond will the handicap parking be? And we should clarify, this is not general handicap parking. This is specific DEC designated handicap parking. So you have to have a specific type of tag to access this parking lot. And I'm not sure we have that answer, but Howie, you may know.
Yeah, well, as I said earlier, the current DEC parking lot, the trailhead, if you will, to go down to the lake is about 1,400, 1,500 feet, I think, back from the lake. The back of the Debar private parcel would be about 700 feet back from the lake, and the new public parking area that's proposed is adjoining the Debar parcel on the rear side. So it will literally public will be able to park about 700-800 feet back from the lake. There'll be a gate and entrance to the private parcel. There'll be a clear path down to the lake for the public. Right now, every time I've been there, I've seen individuals and couples carrying their canoes and kayaks or wheeling their canoes and kayaks down to the pond. And that will continue. As I say, the most accessible access for a boat into the pond will be on the public land still. And so and then the question was about the handicap park. That I think Aaron, actually it was you and Peter Frank of DEC who walked around most recently looking at the best spot for the handicaps, the special permit handicap for the state will have the right of way to use for the public. And I think that's about 300 feet back from the lake. So a shorter walk and with some hardened paths that go from there down to the lake shore. So certainly more convenient than it's been these last 20 years of state ownership.
There was a question about the greenhouse on the site and whether it will be reopened.
We haven't made any definitive decisions in our imagination about it, if this all goes forward, exactly the best use of the auxiliary buildings. The greenhouse is in particularly sorry condition. My own fairly careful look at it says if there's going to be a greenhouse, it's going to have to be a total rebuild. So I think that's a decision for the future as to whether that's the best use of those dollars or that's how feasible it is to do so.
There's a couple questions about volunteering and also about staying connected with Debar Pond Institute.
At the current time, as far as the site itself, we don't have volunteer opportunities because we don't own the site. The state owns the site. I mean, it could occur in the coming year or two that we maybe this is nothing that we've discussed yet, but maybe there could be a temporary revocable permit whereby AARCH or the Debar Pond Institute might do some volunteer work to keep the site from getting too overgrown or to do some preservation activity that's needed. And so then maybe there'd be opportunities for volunteering before the amendment concludes and successfully, hopefully, and then once the Debar Pond Institute would own the property, of course, there would be more opportunities for volunteering, but that is a ways in the future.
Could you clarify whether it will be open year round, and if not, whether there'll be a caretaker, and also whether that 1 day a week public access will have a fee? Is the public able to go in and have a tour for free, or is there a charge associated with that?
There will likely be a charge, as Sagamore Institute does on its tours, and as virtually every historic site that needs to have a realistic budget to survive. So there'd probably be a relatively low but a fee. I'm missing the other. I forgot the other part of the question now. First part.
Will it be open year round?
Year round. That's right. I would hope so. It's a beautiful spot in the winter. It's an absolutely gorgeous spot. And I think with a population from Malone that's only 20 minutes to 30 minutes away, just about 20 miles away from this county seat of Franklin County, I think there'll be interest by the public to want to use it and visit year round. And so I hope that would be our hope. Whether that happens the first year of operation or not, I couldn't say. It might take a while to build toward having a year-round program, but that is very much my hope that it be open year-round.
Dave or Howie, do either of you, could you speak to the road and also the trail? There's a question about the condition of the road, and I kind of answered that a little bit, but I think what they're really getting at is who maintains it. But also there's a question about accessing the trail around the pond. The
road needs work. It's as you indicated, Aaron, it's pretty bumpy and rutted, and it's a narrow one-lane road, although there's some areas on the side that where if the grass was cut, there could be some parking, some passing areas. The language in the proposed amendment allows for for the right of way along the road and the right to improve it for safe passage. And so Debar Pond Institute will incur some significant costs in wanting to improve the road and have it be safe. We don't see turning it into a two-lane road, but I think if the sides of the road allow for pulling off and safely seeing what's ahead, it can be done safely and kind of keep the character of a woods road, but have it be more comfortable and convenient and safe.
There's a question about a map for the 406-acre parcel that shows the existing forest preserve lands and Meacham Lake.
I don't know if this is going to be visible or not. It's sort of visible, but you can't really see what you're seeing here. This is a survey map of the property. If you were to look on an Adirondack Park Agency map that shows the different colors, private and public land in the Adirondacks, you would see just to west of Meacham Lake, there's a east of the Route 30, but west of Meacham Lake Road, there's a 2-mile long strip of private land in the rural use category, the yellow on the map. It's that piece of land, very visible on the Adirondack Park Agency map in yellow, and that just to the west of Meacham Pond, but east of Route 30, that is the 406-acre parcel. It's about, ironically, it's located at the edge of the Debar Mountain Wild Forest, also on the west side of it, whereas Debar Pond Lodge is just on the north side.
Dave, I want to give you an opportunity. It seems like we're winding up. There's one last question, which I'm going to give to Howie in a moment. But Dave, I wanted to give you an opportunity to share. You've touched on this already, but it'd be great to hear again why you and Adirondack Wild, Friends of the Forest Preserve, consider this a win-win solution for the park, the Forest Preserve, and Debar Pond Lodge.
Well, it preserves the Forest Preserve. And the values there, the wild character of that area, based on the plans that Howie has described, and that within the draft easement. does that job. It preserves the character of the area, the public interests in the forest preserve, and carving out a small 6-acre private interest in the Great Camp. And but that camp also will provide cultural programming for the Northern Adirondacks. And it's just worth a visit. You know, that whole area, it just draws you right in. Whether it be a future lodge open for public programming, as well as public access and tours, but also to the pond and the twin mountains on either side of this gorgeous sheet of water. It draws you right in, and it makes you aware that this is something special, and that this is part of the Adirondack Forest Preserve, and the values and principles which the preserve is managed and stewarded for the public benefits. So all those things add up to us as a public benefit, a community benefit. Other than that, we would not be supporting this. We're just a private interest to preserve a building on set within the forest preserve. We would have no interest, but the public benefits are very, very significant here, and it is well worth getting behind, I think.
Howie, could you share for everybody in the audience, you know, the timeline and perhaps an action item they might be able to take on the amendment? I know you kind of went through it, but maybe you can hit just the key dates that we're talking about again.
Well, if all goes well, we would pass the legislature in this year, 2023. But if not, there's 2024. And in any case, if then a new legislature would be elected in November 2024, and it would be the 2025 when the second passage in the next legislature could take place. And then if that happened successfully, then it would go to the voters of New York State in November 2025. In 2025, we hope everybody will turn out and vote yes on the proposition. But short of that, I mean, we've debated as to what extent to enlist the Friends of Debar to contact state legislators now during the legislative process. We haven't mounted a significant campaign for that because it seemed premature. It seemed we should save that for the amendment, for the referendum that comes before the voters.
I just mentioned that is how much support is being given by Senator Dan Stack, State Senator Dan Stack, in the Senate, and of course former Assemblyman Engelbright, who used to chair the ENCON committee in the Assembly, really got behind this last year. He's no longer in the Assembly, but I think it's going to be a building of support for your proposal.
Yeah. We enormous appreciation to our local Assemblyman Billy Jones, who is the lead sponsor of the amendment, and his colleague Matt Simpson, who also represents part of the Adirondacks. And then, as you mentioned, Senator Dan Steck has been enormously invaluable. They and their staffs, we really appreciate everything they've done. They see this as just an important part of enriching the cultural life of the North Country, and so they've been great allies.
There was a great question here about accessing the western side of the western side of the pond in Debar Mountain, and I put this in the chat, but I wanted to say and fill in any details I'm missing here, Howie, but there will be an easement, there will be a path alongside the western part of the parcel that is part of the amendment, so that there's public access through that path. That's an easement to the dam. There's a little dam where you cross over to get to that side of the pond. So, and that was a discussion among the group and, AARCH and the Preservation League and Debar Pond Institute and DEC to make sure that that's well cited, it's obvious, and that the public will have will have access to that park. So there will be continued public access, and I wanted to underscore that.
That's
good
exactly right. So the public access, as you say, will go through the western, from the same parking area. You can go down to the eastern side of the property to the pond, or the western side of the property through the property to cross the dam, and then you're on a trail. The trail exists now. It's kind of overgrown, but I've walked the trail for about a quarter of a mile. And since I didn't want to climb Debar Pond Mountain that day, I didn't continue, and I was meaning to go back. I don't know myself, I've got some more bushwhacking ahead of me. I don't know what state the trail around the pond is in. I'm told that it existed in the past, that you could walk around the pond, but I've not done it myself. That might, but there is definitely a trail that starts down the western side of the lake that exists. And it, once restored, a trail around the pond should be a terrific recreational resource for the public and for anybody staying at Debar Pond Lodge.
There was a question or a comment about keeping it in the forest preserve and having it be wild forest, yet having it be publicly accessible, ruining the wilderness with public being there. I think that we've kind of talked a little bit about that, but I kind of thought it might be worth reiterating, this is public land. The public does visit that land, and it will remain publicly accessible. But I don't know, Dave, do you want to say something about that?
Yeah, I think you've said it, Erin. It is forest preserve. It's classified wild forest, and that's an appropriate classification given the presence of the lodge, but also the surroundings and the Meacham Lake Campground was south of there. But the wild character of the area is there today, and this proposal doesn't harm that, doesn't project to harm that in the future. In fact, it's just the opposite in terms of what the department was originally planning here, which would have some very serious adverse impacts on the character. This proposal, and I'm so glad to have seen the draft easement, because it satisfies us that that character will be preserved and can be preserved, because there's enough space for the lodge to undergo its work, its activities for the public, and for the public who may or may not be interested in those programs to reach the pond and the mountains beyond and the trails that Howie was describing.
I would add that maybe this would be a good final statement for me if we're ready to stop, but that there will always be some people, and I don't know if that was implied in the questioner's comment, there will always be some who will favor as much wild land as possible, and in the extreme case, they would love to see much of the built environment in the Adirondacks removed and the area returned to wilderness to the greatest extent possible. So people of goodwill on both sides could differ on this. There are some people who would say, well, yeah, that's all very nice about saving this historic building, but we would our value system says we would rather just see it all wild. And we have friends in that camp who have worked very hard to ensure wildness in the Adirondacks before, as both Dave has and I have. But we have a little different view, which is that in specific instances, it's very possible to have historic buildings, public use, side by side in a complementary relationship with the wild lands around it. And sometimes that synergy even each enhances the other, with the buildings setting off the landscape in a way, or calling attention to the landscape, or enabling people to come and have an excuse to come to enjoy the landscape, while at the same time, of course, the landscape enhances the experience from the historic building. So AARCH, obviously, those in the Adirondacks who for years have worked to save historic sites, to have an example like Sagamore, where thousands of people both enjoy the wilderness around Sagamore and enjoy Sagamore and the historic character itself, that those of us and Adirondack Architectural Heritage in particular, who has worked for 30 years now to try to find a balance, to try to find a partnership between environmental conservation and historic preservation, we see it a little differently. We see that's why we call this the win-win solution, because we believe we can enhance both the values of environmental conservation with historic preservation and cultural preservation. And we think if all goes well, Debar will be a shining example of that blending of important values.
Dave, do you want to give any closing, kind of a closing comment?
No, I just applaud what Howie said, and I look forward to continued memos of support for this from Adirondack Wild to members of the legislature and to the public. I think it's very important that this proposal move forward. And I remember, I wasn't around, but Sagamore took a long time too. It just took a long time to get through, but it succeeded, and this proposal will too. I'm very, very confident.
I just want to thank you both so very much, Howie and Dave, for this conversation today and for sharing more information about the details on this proposal. And I think one of the great things about this kind of preservation effort is that it requires really thoughtful consideration when we're talking about historic resources in the forest preserve. And it's not something entered into lightly, and it requires a thoughtful public benefit solution, which is one that we have here today.